The wound that should have killed. The thing about Darien Voss was that silence was not something he endured. It was something he inhabited. He wore quiet the way other people wore skin, naturally, without thinking about it, as though the universe had simply assembled him that way from the beginning. His coworkers at the Verath 9 Independent Docking Collective had a running joke that Darien could communicate an entire diagnostic report through the angle of his eyebrows and a single exhale. His landlord, a four-armed Keth named Pross who managed the residential block in Bay 7, had once confided to a neighbor that in 3 years of tenancy, Darien Voss had spoken fewer total words to him than most residents said in a single argument about maintenance fees. Pross said this without malice. It was simply observation, like nodding that water was wet or that the station's atmospheric recyclers smelled faintly of copper when the filters needed changing. Darien noticed the filter smell before anyone else did too. He'd replaced them twice without being asked and left the invoice in Pross's mail slot with no note attached. That was Darien. He was 34 years old, a human of average height and unremarkable appearance. Brown hair kept short not out of vanity, but because long hair caught in machinery, dark eyes that tended to settle on things with a weight that made people mildly uncomfortable without knowing why, and hands that told an entire autobiography on their own. Scarred, calloused, stained with machine oil in the creases around his knuckles that no amount of washing fully removed. The hands of someone who had been taking things apart and putting them back together since childhood, who had learned early that the universe made more sense when you understood its components. He'd grown up in the outer ring settlements, where the ships were old and the budgets were thin, and a mechanic who could coax another 1,000 hours of flight out of an engine that should have been scrapped was worth more than his weight in refined fuel. He had never attended a formal engineering academy. He had, however, read every technical manual he could get his hands on since the age of 8, asked questions of every engineer, pilot, and shipwright willing to answer them, and developed the particular genius of people who learn by doing, a deep, intuitive understanding of why things worked, not just how. He'd arrived on Verath 9 3 years ago with a toolbox, a salvaged work terminal, and a reputation that had preceded him by word of mouth through 7 different trading posts. Within 6 months, his service bay was booked 2 weeks in advance. Within a year, he'd turned down 3 job offers from corporations whose names appeared on the sides of ships he regularly fixed, because corporate work meant corporate hours and corporate oversight, and a very specific kind of talking that Darien had no patience for. He preferred his bay, he preferred his tools. He preferred the particular, honest satisfaction of a thing broken becoming a thing fixed. His neighbors in the residential block had over time developed a collective understanding of him the way communities develop understanding of local weather patterns, not through formal study, but through accumulated experience. They knew he left for his bay at the same time every morning, carrying coffee in a battered thermal flask. They knew the lights in his unit stayed on late when he had a complex job. They knew that if something in the building broke, a door seal, a plumbing coupling, a climate control unit, it would be repaired within 24 hours whether or not anyone had officially reported it, and that Darien would not mention having done it. They knew most importantly that he was dependable in the particular way that very few people are dependable, not because he announced it or promised it, but because he simply was consistently, without exception, the way gravity was dependable or the way a well-machined bearing was dependable. He did what needed doing. He asked nothing in return. And if you needed to know something was true about the man, you looked at what his hands had built, not at anything he said. His next-door neighbor, the one whose unit shared a wall with his, separated by 40 centimeters of composite paneling, was a draconi named Scirak. Scirak was, by any objective measurement, an extraordinary creature. The draconi were one of the oldest spacefaring species in the known galaxy, predating human faster-than-light travel by roughly 3,000 years, and they carried that history in their bearing the way ancient mountains carried theirs, without announcement, without performance, simply as a quality of presence that you felt before you consciously registered it. They were large, winged, scaled, and possessed of a biological and intellectual complexity that had humbled more than one species, who'd made the mistake of underestimating them based on their appearance. Scirak stood when standing at approximately 12 feet from the ground, longer from snout to tail tip than Darien's work bay was wide. His scales were a deep copper green, the color of old bronze left to weather in sea air, and they caught light differently depending on the angle, sometimes warm and amber-toned, sometimes the cold blue-green of deep ocean. His wingspan, fully extended, was something that required open space to fully appreciate, and which he rarely deployed indoors, out of what Darien had eventually recognized as consideration for others, since the alternative was to knock things over. His eyes were amber, Deep, fuel-dark amber with the vertical pupils common to Draconi, and they held within them the particular quality of intelligence that has been long practiced, not clever, not sharp in the quick human sense, but deep in the way that a very old river is deep, patient, observant, unhurried. He was in temperament proud, not arrogant. There was a difference, and Darien had learned it by paying attention. Arrogance dismissed, pride held. Sirek held himself to standards and held others to theirs, and if he found someone lacking he did not say so, he simply withdrew the particular quality of his regard. When he extended it, you knew, it felt like being recognized. He was also, Darien had discovered, kind, not warmly, demonstratively kind, not the kind that announced itself, but the kind that noticed. Twice in the first winter of their acquaintance, when Darien had been down with a respiratory illness that the station medics had treated as routine but that had left him genuinely hollow for 2 weeks, he'd found meals outside his door. No note, no explanation. Draconi cuisine, which required knowing what a human could safely eat, which meant Sirek had looked it up, which meant he had noticed the illness and decided, quietly and privately, to do something about it. When Darien had thanked him briefly, simply, the way he did everything, Sirek had regarded him with those amber eyes and said with complete composure, "I noticed nothing. I left nothing. I do not know what you are referring to," and had then turned and gone back into his unit with the dignity of a creature who had absolutely not just been caught in an act of neighborly care. Darien had almost smiled. They had understood each other from very early on, in the way that two people who both speak primarily through action rather than word understand each other, not by discussing it, but by recognizing the grammar. They did not spend long evenings in conversation. They did not share meals deliberately or make social plans. But there was between them a quality of presence that was its own kind of closeness, a mutual awareness, a mutual reliability, an unspoken and unexamined trust that had grown from 3 years of small, consistent things. When Sirek's ventilation coupling broke at 11 at night and began making a sound that no ventilation coupling should make, Darien had appeared at his door with tools within 20 minutes without being called. When Darien's work terminal had been struck by a power surge and he'd lost 3 weeks of technical schematics, Sirek had spent 2 days cross-referencing sources in 6 different technical databases he had access to through Draconi Sovereignty Council archives, and had left a data chip outside Darien's door containing most of what had been lost. No note, no explanation. Darien had knocked on his door and said, "Thank you." Sirek had said, "I found nothing useful." The data chip had contained everything. That was the nature of what they were to each other. Neighbors. In the truest, oldest, most fundamental sense of the word, the people who shared your space, who knew the sound of your footsteps through a wall, who could be relied upon when things went wrong. The people you came home to, even if home was a station bay in the outer rings and you never said so out loud. It was the 14th day of the 3rd month of the station's calendar year when Darien found him. He was returning from an early morning supply run. He'd placed an order for a set of micro-calibration bearings, and the supplier had messaged to say they'd arrived at the dock office, which meant a 40-minute walk through the lower transit corridors before his bay opened. He was thinking about the job they were for, a navigational gimbal assembly on a mid-range courier ship whose owner had been coaxed into believing the wobble in her jump calculations was a software issue when it was clearly, obviously, a physical alignment problem that would cause a catastrophic calibration failure inside 6 months if left unaddressed. He'd written the owner a 3-sentence explanation. She had read it, understood it, and booked the repair. He was thinking about the gimbal, about the bearing tolerance, about the specific approach he'd used to reseat the housing without having to pull the entire navigational unit. He turned into the maintenance corridor behind the residential block, a shortcut he used regularly, a narrow service passage that ran behind the rear units and smelled of recycled air and composite paneling, and almost stepped on Sirek's tail. He stopped. The corridor was not wide. Sirek, collapsed against the left wall, occupied most of it. He was on his side, which was wrong. Draconi almost never adopted lateral positions in anything less than their most private spaces, the equivalent of being found face down on the floor. One wing was folded against his body in the tight protective curl that Darien associated with pain response. The other was wrong, extended at an angle that had nothing to do with any natural position. The joint near the base bent in a direction that made the mechanic's brain register structural failure in the same flat, immediate way it registered a cracked chassis or a fractured load-bearing bracket. And he was bleeding. 3 wounds on his left side, between the plates of his larger dorsal scales in the narrower, softer-scaled region beneath the wing root. Deep punctures, each roughly 3 centimeters in diameter, with the specific character of something that had punched in and then withdrawn, not tearing wounds, not blast damage. Designed, deliberate. The dark copper brown of Draconi blood was seeping from all three, slow and continuous in the way that immediately told Darien this was not clotting normally. Because Draconi clotting was fast, almost dramatically so, one of their notable biological advantages, and a wound like this should have already been significantly slowed. It had not slowed. He was losing blood steadily, and he had been for some time. The composite floor beneath him was dark with it. His scales, which should have caught the corridor lighting and held their warm metal color, were dull. The amber of his eyes when one opened fractionally at the sound of Darien's footsteps was darker than it should have been. Deeper. Flat in a way that meant the body was pulling resources inward. Darien set down his bag of bearings. He did not say, "Oh my God," or "What happened to you," or any of the other reasonable, human, emotionally appropriate things a person says when they find a friend bleeding out on a corridor floor. His mind had already moved past that, not because he didn't feel it, the cold shock of it, the weight of it landing in his chest like something physical, but because he was the kind of person who processed feeling through action rather than before it. The feelings were there. They would be there later. Right now there was a problem, and problems had components, and components could be addressed. He crouched down and opened his toolbox. "Do not," Sirek rasped, without opening his eye further, "make a fuss." His voice was wrong, too thin. The resonance that usually lived in a Draconi voice, that harmonic depth, that quality of something large and old was gone, scraped out by blood loss and pain, and what was left was something that did not sound like Sirek. It sounded like what Sirek's voice would be if most of what made it Sirek's had been subtracted. Darien looked at him for 1 second. Just one. Long enough to take in the full picture, the wounds, the wing, the blood volume, the eye, the breathing, and let his brain finish assembling the situation into something he could work with. "I won't," he said. He meant it as a promise. He kept it. His emergency patch kit was in the lower left compartment of his toolbox, which was not a standard location for an emergency patch kit, but was the location that made sense to Darien because it was the compartment he reached for when something was failing in a way that threatened structural integrity. Industrial biosealant foam, rated for hull breaches up to 15 centimeters. He'd carried it for years because a mechanic working on live ships was always potentially one equipment failure away from a situation where fast sealing was the difference between fixable and not. He worked without speaking, because speech would have taken attention he needed for his hands and given nothing useful in return. The wounds were bad up close. The puncture geometry was precise, not random damage but engineered penetration designed to get past scale. Someone had known what they were doing. The edges of the wounds had the faint chemical discoloration that he recognized, with a cold and specific fury he did not show on his face. From a job he'd done 3 years ago, a Draconi cargo hauler whose crew had walked him through their personal medical supplies and emergency protocols, including a lengthy, grim explanation of why Draconi operating in certain trade routes carried anticoagulant countermeasures. Anticoagulant munitions, the crew chief had told him. Designed specifically for them, engineered to shut down their clotting response. Expensive, illegal, and very hard to get. The wounds weren't just deep, they'd been dosed. Someone had wanted Sirek to bleed slowly, unable to stop it for as long as possible. The fury sat in Darien's chest, very flat and very still, like something placed carefully on a shelf for later. He noted it, he left it there. He packed the first wound with biosealant. The foam expanded into the puncture channel, filling the void, beginning the process of sealing the blood loss at its source. He pressed the patch over it with both thumbs, hard and flat, holding the 10 seconds required for initial adhesion. Second wound, third wound, methodical, complete. The wing he assessed without touching it yet. Moving it was a secondary problem, and moving it wrong would compound the injury. He noted the joint geometry, mapped what he could see of the damage, stored it. The bleeding slowed, not stopped. The anticoagulant was still active in the bloodstream, and the sealant was working against it, but slowed. Enough for now. And then Sirek's breathing changed. It had been shallow and fast before, the breathing of something in pain, burning through what it had. Now it became something worse. Slower, yes, but wrong, the kind of slow that wasn't rest, that was the body beginning to make the terrible calculation that fighting was no longer viable. The amber eye that had been fractionally open closed completely. The tail, which had been making small involuntary movements against the floor, went still. Darien had read a lot of things. Most people who knew him didn't know how much, because he read in the same way he did everything else, quietly, privately, without announcing it. He read technical manuals, yes, and engineering texts, and materials science journals that would have cured the insomnia of most adults in 4 pages. But he also read, because he worked on ships crewed by dozens of species, and because he believed that understanding the people who depended on your work was part of the work. Everything he could find about the biology of the species he lived and worked alongside. He had read in a Draconi medical document he'd found while doing a refit on a medical transport 18 months ago. Read it at 3 in the morning while waiting for a compound cure to set because he had nothing else to do about the cervical arterial ridge. A structure unique to Draconi physiology, running along both sides of the neck where the major systemic blood vessels ran closest to the surface. In extreme blood loss scenarios, the document had stated sustained external compression of the cervical arterial ridge could trigger an ancient autonomic survival response, a dramatic slowing of the cardiac cycle, reducing systemic demand, buying time. A last mechanism, it had noted, not a solution, a delay. The document had also noted that the compression required was very specific. Too little, and you achieved nothing. Too much, and you caused secondary damage. It had included a diagram with precise anatomical coordinates. Darian had a very good memory for things he read. He moved to Sirac's head. It was heavy, dragon skulls were dense, the bone thick, the whole structure built to survive forces that would shatter most things. Got both hands beneath the jaw and shifted it carefully until he could position himself. And then he placed the large head, all of it, the weight and heat of it, the strange intimacy of it, into his lap. And he pressed both palms flat against the sides of Sirac's neck, finding the ridge through the scales by feel, adjusting his hand position with the same minute precision he used when hand-fitting a bearing race, until he felt the pulse beneath his palms and felt more than thought that he had the right place. He pressed steady, even both sides simultaneously as the document had specified. He waited. The corridor was very quiet. The station hummed around them, its vast mechanical body doing what it always did, indifferent. The recycled air moved through vents above. Somewhere far off, a loading droid made its repetitive passage. Sirac's breathing, which had been doing the terrible wrong thing, stuttered. Paused. Then deepened. Not the sharp, desperate deep breath of someone startled back to consciousness, but a slow, profound deepening like a tide pulling back. The cardiac conservation response, the ancient thing, the body remembering something that had been true about it for millions of years before it ever saw a space station. The breathing settled into a rhythm that was slower than sleep, deeper than rest, the rhythm of something very old pulling itself back from an edge by instinct, by the bone memory of survival. The color incrementally, fraction by fraction, began to return to Sirac's scales. Darian held pressure and did not move. He sent the medical alert from his wristband with his thumb, a 3-word automated message to the station medward with the corridor coordinates, without looking at it, without lifting his hands. Then he sat in the corridor with a dragon's head in his lap, both palms pressed flat against the pulse of something enormous and alive, and he stayed. He stayed for 47 minutes. He did not talk because there was nothing to say that his hands were not already saying. He did not move because moving meant releasing the pressure. He did not look at his wristband to check the time or check for messages or do any of the things that human beings did when sitting in silence was uncomfortable, because the silence was not uncomfortable. He was a person who inhabited silence. He inhabited it now the way he always did, completely, without apology, without performance. Just staying. Just holding on. When Dr. Yuvali arrived with the med team, a Keth physician, compact and quick-moving with the calm urgency of someone who had seen a great deal and found the scene in the corridor, she stopped for a full 3 seconds before saying anything. There was something about the image that stopped her. The human mechanic absolutely still on the floor. The dragon's head, heavy and enormous and copper green, held with a care that was visible from the doorway, the hands on the neck, the steadiness of it. She had been a physician for 22 years. She had seen many things. She approached carefully, assessed quickly, and said with genuine professional shock, "You're holding cervical compression. How long?" Darian checked his wristband, 44 minutes. She stared at him. "How did you know to do that?" He considered the question while the med team began setting up around him. Sirac's breathing was still slow and deep, the conservation rhythm holding steady, the wounds sealed, the immediate catastrophe paused at the edge where Darian had held it. "Read it somewhere," he said. She stared at him for another moment. Then she began directing her team with the brisk efficiency of someone who had questions, but understood that answers could wait. Darian held on until they were ready to transfer, until the moment where his pressure could be replaced by a medical device. The handoff managed in 3 seconds without breaking the compression, and then he stood, stepped back, and watched them work. He was covered in blood, his hands, his lap, the front of his jacket, copper brown, draconi dark, already beginning to dry at the edges. He looked at his hands for a moment the way he looked at everything, with that quiet, considering attention, not reading emotion into the sight of them but simply seeing. Then he picked up his toolbox, retrieved his bag of calibration bearings from where he'd left them against the wall, and moved to the corridor's edge to stay out of the med team's way. His mind had already gone somewhere else. Gone to a small, flat, cold place that was not grief and not rage but something quieter than both. The place he went when he understood a problem completely, when the full shape of it had resolved into clarity, when he knew precisely what needed to be done. The wounds had been deliberate. The anticoagulant was deliberate. Someone had done this to Sirek and had done it well with knowledge and equipment and intent, and had then apparently let him go, or he had escaped, or something had interrupted the completion of whatever this was supposed to be, and Sirek, bleeding and unable to stop it, had come home. Had come specifically here. Had ended up in this corridor, outside these units, and had waited. Darian stood at the corridor wall and held his toolbox and thought about that, and the flat, cold place in his mind got very still and very precise, the way it did before a complicated job. He had a lot of reading to do. He had a lot of work ahead of him. He went home and he started planning. What he built in 3 days. The station's night cycle had settled over Verath 9 like a held breath when Darian finally closed the medward door behind him. Sirek was stable. That was the word Dr. Yuvali had used, stable, with the specific careful weight of a physician who meant it as a factual assessment and not a reassurance, because reassurance implied uncertainty and stable meant stable. The anticoagulant compound had been identified, catalogued, and was being counteracted through a slow IV drip that would run through the night. The wounds were sealed properly now medically with equipment designed for the purpose. The wing joint had been immobilized. The cardiac conservation response had been carefully unwound over 2 hours. Sirek's heart rate coaxed back to normal rhythm in stages, like a machine being brought up from cold start. He would need weeks to heal. The wing would need careful, specific support during recovery or the joint would set wrong. His systemic blood chemistry would take time to fully clear. These were the facts, delivered plainly, and Darian had listened to all of them with the same flat attention he gave a technical briefing. He had asked 3 questions. The first, what was the precise molecular composition of the anticoagulant compound? Dr. Yuvali had given him a look that occupied the specific territory between professional curiosity and mild suspicion. But she'd answered, because the question was clinically reasonable, and because there was something about the way Darian asked things that suggested the answer would not be wasted. The second, what were the documented failure modes of the standard Draconi wing recovery brace currently used by the station medward? This question had produced a longer look and a shorter answer. The standard brace worked adequately. Dr. Yuvali said, though she acknowledged when pressed, that the joint geometry calibration had been a known issue in the manufacturing spec for several years, and the supplier had not updated the design. The third, had anyone checked the wounds for secondary foreign material before sealing? Dr. Yuvali had stopped moving when he asked that one, had turned to look at him with both of her wide Keth eyes, pale gold and very still. What kind of secondary material? She said. Something small, Darian said. Passive, probably ceramic composite housing, which is why your scanner would have read it as biological debris. Third wound, deep tissue. I'd look before you finish the closure. The silence in the medward had lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then Dr. Yuvali had turned back to her team and issued a very quiet, very clipped series of instructions. And 20 minutes later, she had found in the deepest channel of the third wound a passive signal node the size of a grain of rice. Ceramic composite housing, just as he'd said, threaded with the fine metallic filament of a long-range broadcast antenna so thin it had registered on the scanner as organic debris. She had come back to where Darian stood against the wall and looked at him with an expression that had moved past professional curiosity entirely into something more personal. You knew that was there, she said. I thought it was probably there, he said. How? He had thought about how to answer that. Not because he was being evasive. Evasion required more words than he generally cared to use, and also struck him as a waste of everyone's time, but because the honest answer was complicated in a way that was hard to compress. The wounds were too clean, he said finally. Someone who goes to the trouble of using anticoagulant munitions is trying to slow a Draconi down without finishing them immediately. You slow them down, you let them go, you follow the blood trail, or you follow a signal. Blood trail on a station gets cleaned by environmental systems in 4 hours. Signal works longer. He paused, made more sense. Dr. Yuvali had studied him for a long moment. You're a mechanic, she said. Yes, he said. You should perhaps consider medicine. I prefer machines, he said. They're more honest about what's wrong with them. He'd left the medward with the tracker node in a small sealed sample container that Dr. Yuvali had, after a moment's consideration, allowed him to take. Because the node was not biological material, was technically outside her jurisdiction. and because she had the distinct impression that arguing the point with this particular human would be approximately as productive as arguing with a load-bearing wall. He walked home through the quiet station corridors, the container in his jacket pocket, his toolbox in his hand, thinking. The lights in Bay 7 came on at 3:20 that morning and did not go off again for 71 hours. The neighbors noticed. Not with alarm, Darian's bay lights sometimes burned late, and his neighbors had long since calibrated their concern accordingly. But 71 consecutive hours was notable even by his standards, and there was something different about the quality of activity they could hear through the shared ventilation, not the rhythmic, methodical sounds of regular repair work, but something more varied, more intense, punctuated by long silences that were somehow louder than the work sounds. The Aurelian family on the upper level, Rithava and her 3 children, reported later that they had looked through the small reinforced window in their floor that overlooked his bay on the second night, and had seen Darian standing motionless at his workbench, both hands flat on the surface, staring at something they couldn't see. He had stood like that for nearly 2 hours. Then he had sat down, pulled a datapad toward him, and begun reading at a speed that Rithava described as alarming. He was reading everything he could find. The tracker node first, he'd pulled it apart under his bench magnifier within 20 minutes of getting home, cataloging every component with the careful precision of someone who understood that understanding a thing completely was the first requirement of dealing with it properly. The node was sophisticated, not military grade but close, the kind of hardware that suggested significant resources and specific expertise. The broadcast frequency was narrowband, low power, designed to ping a receiver at intervals rather than broadcast continuously, which was smart because continuous broadcast could be detected by standard station security sweeps. Interval pinging flew under the automated detection threshold. He noted the frequency. He noted the encryption architecture. He noted the manufacturing signatures on the core components, cross-referencing them against the parts databases he had access to through 3 different supplier networks. Then he moved outwards. He read about anticoagulant munitions, not from any database that would log the search against his station ID, but from archived technical documents he accessed through a back channel his years of independent work had given him. The kind of gray area technical library that mechanics in the outer rings maintained for each other, because official repair manuals were expensive and information about non-standard weapons that might damage the ships you serviced was professionally relevant, and nobody was going to pretend otherwise. The anticoagulant compound used on S-Sirac was sophisticated, not a general-purpose product, but something engineered specifically for Draconi biology, targeting the precise enzymatic pathway that drove their accelerated clotting response. That kind of specificity required not just chemistry expertise, but very detailed Draconi biological data. That meant either someone with Draconi medical knowledge or someone with access to it. He read about Draconi physiology. He had read some of it before, the cervical arterial document and general biological texts, but now he read with purpose, looking not just for information but for the shape of a picture that was forming at the edges of his comprehension. He read about Draconi scale composition and its value in certain industrial applications. About bone density and what the pharmaceutical applications of synthesized Draconi bone compounds had been, theoretically, in research that had been formally banned by the Galactic Coalition 17 years ago, but which he noted, reading between the lines of 3 separate archived research papers, had apparently continued in unregistered facilities. He read about missing Draconi. This part took the longest. The information was fragmented, scattered across incident reports, community bulletins in Draconi language networks that required translation, Coalition missing persons archives that he accessed through a public terminal query he structured carefully to look like background research for a freight contract. But the pattern assembled itself as patterns always did when you looked at enough data, slowly at first, then with the sudden, cold clarity of something that had been there all along waiting to be seen. Over 6 years, dozens of cases, predominantly in the outer ring systems where station security was thinner and traffic was high and the kind of ship that could move cargo without being asked questions about it was common. Draconi who had been reported as having departed and not arrived. Draconi who had simply not been heard from. A Draconi cargo chief on a run through the Verath outer rings who had sent a distress signal that had been logged, investigated superficially, and closed as equipment malfunction. The distress signal had originated from coordinates 40 minutes from Verath 9. Darian sat with that for a while. Then he got up and made coffee and drank it standing at his workbench looking at the tracker node in its sample container, and the flat, cold place in his mind got deeper and quieter and more specific, the way it did when the full shape of a problem had finally revealed itself completely. He understood what had happened to S-Sirac. He understood why. He understood that it was not a random act of violence or a personal vendetta or any of the other things it might have been. He understood that S-Sirac was one point in a pattern that had been operating for 6 years, that what had been done to his neighbor was not exceptional but routine, and that the routine had continued precisely because nobody had yet assembled the pieces the way he was assembling them now. He understood, which was the part that settled into his chest with the weight of a very old and very heavy thing, that fixing S-Sirac was not the same as fixing the problem. He had told S-Sirac this once, in a different context, about a ship whose pilot had wanted the symptom addressed and not the cause. He had told her that the symptom was the leak, and the cause was the corroded coupling behind the bulkhead, and that sealing the leak meant the coupling would fail somewhere else in 6 months, and this time it might fail in a way she couldn't walk away from. He believed this, he had always believed this. He finished his coffee, he went back to his workbench. He started building. The exoskeleton came first, because S-Sirac needed it soonest, and because building it was in some ways the simpler problem, the one where the requirements were clearly defined and the solution was primarily engineering. The standard Draconi wing recovery brace that the Medward used was, by Darian's assessment, a product designed by someone who understood Draconi anatomy from textbooks and had never personally observed a Draconi in motion. The joint geometry calibration error Dr. Yuvali had acknowledged was not a minor flaw. It was an 11-degree deviation from the natural resting angle of the secondary wing joint, which meant the brace held the wing in a position that was close to correct but was not correct, and was not correct in a way that mattered enormously over the weeks of a recovery period, because tissue healed to the shape it was held in. An 11-degree deviation over 6 weeks of healing meant an 11-degree deviation in the healed structure, which in a wing that needed to bear flight loads meant chronic stress concentration at exactly the point of maximum force transfer. It would heal wrong, not dramatically wrong, not obviously wrong, wrong enough to hurt, wrong enough to limit, wrong enough that S-Sirac would carry it for the rest of his life and probably never know why the wing that had been injured felt different from the one that hadn't. Darian was not going to allow that. He started with the joint geometry. He had measured S-Sirac's wing structure with his eyes during the recovery process in a way that would have seemed unconscious to an observer, but was not. He had been cataloging angles and proportions with the part of his brain that never fully turned off, the part that was always reading the geometry of the physical world around it. He cross-referenced what he'd observed against the Draconi anatomical literature and against the specific measurements available in S-Sirac's Medward file, which Dr. Yuvali had shared because the situation warranted it, and because she had already decided that this mechanic was going to do something useful with the information. The frame he designed was titanium composite, light enough to be worn continuously without fatigue loading on a healing structure, strong enough to carry the static and dynamic loads of a Draconi going about daily movement. He fabricated the primary members on his mill, setting tolerances to 1/10 of a millimeter because anything wider than that accumulated into meaningful error at the scale of a 12-foot creature. He cut the articulation joints by hand, fitting them individually, because machined fits at this tolerance required hand finishing to actually achieve the number on paper. He worked the way he always worked, completely absorbed, without waste motion, each action chosen and deliberate. His hands moved with the particular confidence of someone who had done this 10,000 times in 1,000 variations, the confidence that was not arrogance but simple knowledge, the knowledge that came from 10,000 previous problems solved and not solved and half solved and eventually solved, and the accumulated understanding of what worked and what seemed like it would work but didn't and why. The biocompound system took him the better part of 1 full day. The anticoagulant countermeasure was the hard part, not because synthesizing the base compound was beyond him, but because doing it from components he had on hand required a degree of creative chemistry that pushed the edges of his knowledge, and required 2 hours of intensive reading mid-process to confirm he was not about to create something that would help instead of harm. The compound was related to an industrial rust inhibitor he used regularly. The molecular structure shared enough with the anticoagulant's target pathway that a modified version could competitively bind the same enzymatic sites and restore normal clotting function. He was not a chemist. He knew this about himself with the same clarity that he knew everything about himself. But he was someone who understood structures, and molecular structures were structures, and the principle of how they fit together and where they failed was the same principle he applied to everything. He ran 3 test syntheses before he was satisfied. He tested each one against a simulated enzymatic model on his work terminal. The 3rd formulation worked. He integrated the slow-release system into the exoskeleton's inner lining. a series of micro-reservoirs connected to a diffusion membrane that would deliver the compound at a controlled rate over 48 hours, enough to fully clear what remained of the anticoagulant in SCRAC's system. He designed the reservoirs to be refillable, because the Medward's countermeasure drip would eventually be removed, and he wanted the option to continue treatment if the clearance wasn't complete. The heating element came next. This was comparatively straightforward, a resistive heating mesh woven into the dorsal surface of the exoskeleton, powered by a thin-film battery integrated into the frame, thermostatically controlled to maintain the surface temperature at the specific range optimal for Draconi tissue healing. It was a detail that the standard brace omitted entirely, because the standard brace had been designed without accounting for the 40% healing rate reduction that cold temperatures caused in Draconi biology. Darian had read about this once, he had filed it away, he had not expected to use it. He used it now. The signal dampening layer was last, and it was the layer that had taken 2 of his 6 hours of standing still thinking time to work out properly, because it required solving 2 problems simultaneously. It needed to block the specific broadcast frequency of the tracker node architecture he'd identified, without interfering with the medical monitoring equipment the Medward would be using, without creating an electromagnetic signature that would itself be detectable, and without adding structural weight that would compromise the recovery function of the rest of the device. He solved it with a woven metallic mesh, the same type used in electromagnetic shielding for sensitive navigation equipment, which he had on hand in quantity because it was a standard component in half a dozen types of ship repair. He tuned the mesh geometry to the specific frequency range he needed by varying the weave density across the surface in a pattern he calculated by hand on a piece of actual paper, because it was faster for him to think that way, the pencil moving across the page in the odd, economical shorthand of someone whose math had always been more visual than symbolic. When it was done, he assembled the complete exoskeleton on his workbench and looked at it for a long time. It was not beautiful, it was not designed to be. It was a working thing, functional surfaces, clean lines that existed because clean lines were structurally efficient, not because he had thought about aesthetics. But there was something in the precision of it that was its own kind of quality, the way a well-made tool had quality, the way a properly fitted machine had quality, the quality of something that would do exactly what it was supposed to do and nothing else, and would keep doing it reliably for as long as it was needed. He picked up the signal dampening layer and held it to the light. The mesh caught it in small, regular patterns, the way chain mail caught light, and for a moment it looked almost decorative, like something that had been made to be worn by something magnificent. He set it back down, put it in the transport crate with the rest. He came to SCRAC's unit on the morning of the 4th day. SCRAC had been discharged from the Medward 18 hours earlier. The Medward was not designed for long-term Draconi housing, a fact that Dr. Uvali had acknowledged with professional regret and practical pragmatism, and SCRAC had made it clear that he intended to recover in his own space with a composure that had apparently not entirely survived the blood loss, but had come back with the blood. Along with his color and the deep amber of his eyes, and the quality of his presence that filled a room differently from how humans filled rooms. He was on his recovery mat when Darian arrived, a large, low platform that occupied most of the main space of his unit, covered in a thermal material that retained heat, positioned near the primary vent because SCRAC, even in health, kept his unit warmer than most of the building's other residents preferred. He was lying in a careful stillness that was not rest but the management of pain, the precise, deliberate motionlessness of someone who had learned exactly which positions hurt and was maintaining the one that didn't. The standard Medward brace was on his wing. It was beige-colored and institutional-looking and sat on the joint at the wrong angle in a way that would not have been visible to most observers, but that Darian could see immediately, the way he could see a misaligned bearing from across a room. He set his crate down. He started unpacking pieces without preamble or explanation. SCRAC watched him. The amber eyes tracked his movements with that deep, unhurried attention, the attention that had weight to it that you could feel on your skin. He did not speak while Darian worked. He understood, after 2 years of sharing a wall with this man, that the working was its own kind of communication and interrupting it was like interrupting a sentence. It took 40 minutes to assemble the exoskeleton fully. Darian fit each component, checked each joint angle against his paper calculations, made 3 small adjustments to the secondary support brackets and 1 to the heating mesh connection that he hadn't been entirely happy with at the bench and was less happy with now. He replaced the Medward brace, carefully, repositioning the wing joint to the correct angle first, feeling the resistance and the correct settling in of a structure finding its proper geometry. When he was done, he stood up, looked at his work for a moment, and then sat down against the wall across from Sirek and waited. The silence stretched between them, not empty silence, not uncomfortable silence, but the particular inhabited silence that was their specific language, the one they had been speaking to each other for 2 years without nomming it. Sirek looked at the exoskeleton. He looked at it for a long time. His tail moved a slow, lateral movement across the mat, the kind of movement that Darien had learned to read as the Draconi equivalent of a very complicated internal weather front working its way through. "You built this," Sirek said. His voice had come back, the resonance, the depth, the quality of something large and old that had been absent in the corridor was present again, and hearing it land in the room normally was something Darien registered in the chest, in the flat cold place which was less cold now than it had been. "Yes," Darien said. "In 3 days. Most of 3 days." As Sirek looked at the exoskeleton, then at Darien, you could have called them Edward had them fit a standard brace. Standard brace would have healed the wing wrong, Darien said. 11 degrees off at the secondary joint, would have held like that through recovery, you'd have had problems with it forever. He paused. Also, it wouldn't have caught the tracker. The amber eyes sharpened, fractionally, in the way that meant Sirek was revising his understanding of something, the tracker. Third wound, deep tissue, ceramic composite housing, passive signal node. Dr. Yuvali found it before she finished the closure. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced the small sealed container. He held it up briefly, then set it on the floor between them. "I've got the broadcast frequency, encryption architecture, component manufacturing signatures." Sirek was very still. "You've been researching," he said, not a question. "Oh yes. How much?" Darien looked at him steadily. There was a version of this conversation where he compressed what he'd found, gave the practical conclusions without the full weight of the picture behind them. He considered that version for exactly 1 second. "Enough," he said, "to know this wasn't about you specifically, and enough to know it's been going on for 6 years, and enough to know that fixing your injuries isn't the same as fixing the problem." The amber eyes held his. As Sirek's tail had stopped moving, the room was very quiet. "What are you going to do?" the dragon said. Darien looked at his hands for a moment, at the machine oil in the creases, at the scars from 1,000 different edges and surfaces and the accumulated evidence of 10,000 problems engaged with directly. "What I do," he said simply. He picked up his empty crate, he stood. "Coffee," he said. As Sirek looked at him with the deep amber eyes, with something in them that had no word in any human language Darien knew, but which he understood anyway, the way you understood things that were communicated directly from one being to another without the imprecision of words. "Yes," the dragon said. Darien made coffee. He made it in Sirek's kitchen, which was large enough to accommodate a human comfortably, and which smelled of mineral warmth and something faintly metallic, the particular ambient scent of a Draconi's living space. He handed the mug across without ceremony. Sirek took it in one careful clawed hand, the mug small against his scale. They sat together in the warm, quiet room, the mechanic and the dragon, the station humming its endless mechanical breath around them. Darien's mind was already working. Somewhere across 11 systems, something that had been operating for 6 years in the confidence that it was too careful, too distributed, too well hidden to be found was continuing to operate unknowing. It did not know about the man in Bay 7. It did not know about his memory for things he read, or his patience, or the flat cold place in him that once engaged did not stop until the problem was solved. It did not know that he had, in 3 days, built a device that had already caught its tracker. It did not know what he was going to build next. Darien drank his coffee and thought about redundant systems. And redundant failure points. And got to work. What stunned the galaxy? The Pale Chain had a name, though they did not use it publicly. Internally in their encrypted communications, in the shorthand of people who dealt in terrible things and had learned to refer to those things with clinical distance, they called themselves that because of the methodology, not chains in the brutal, obvious sense. Pale chains, invisible ones. The kind you didn't feel until you were already caught, already too far from help, already in a situation where the weight of what had been done to you was only becoming apparent as it became too late to matter. They were, by any objective assessment, professionals. They had operated across 11 systems for 6 years without a single successful prosecution. They had survived 3 partial investigations, 2 by Galactic Coalition enforcement divisions, and 1 by a private Draconi Sovereignty Council inquiry. because they were structured in the specific way that organizations built by careful, intelligent people are structured when those people understand that the greatest vulnerability of any network is its center. They had no center. They were distributed, compartmentalized, each node knowing only what it needed to know to perform its function. Each communication routed through enough intermediary relays that tracing any single message back to its origin required resources and time that enforcement agencies, perpetually underfunded and perpetually overwhelmed, had not been able to sustain. They were, in their own estimation, very nearly perfect. They did not know about Darien Voss. They did not know about him the way a well-sealed hull does not know about the specific metallurgical flaw that has been quietly propagating through its structure since manufacture. Because it hasn't revealed itself yet. Because the conditions that will reveal it haven't yet been met. Because the pressure that will find it and follow it to its conclusion hasn't yet been applied. Darien applied pressure the way he did everything else. Quietly, methodically, without announcing it. He started with a tracker. Not to find the pale chain, he'd already made significant progress on that through his database research, but to understand their architecture from the inside, which was different from understanding it from the outside in ways that mattered enormously. The tracker node he'd recovered from Sirak's wound was a single component in a communication system, and a communication system was a machine, and machines had structures, and structures had logic, and logic, if you followed it carefully enough and far enough, led you to understanding. He spent 2 days on the tracker's encryption architecture alone. Not because breaking it was the goal. He had no intention of intercepting pale chain communications directly, because intercepting them required them to not know they were being intercepted, and maintaining that required a level of ongoing operational complexity that was not his strength and not his interest. What he wanted was the fingerprint. Every encryption architecture was built by someone, and the someone left traces in the way the architecture was assembled, choices about structure and protocol that reflected the builder's training, their habits, their assumptions about what needed protecting and how. Reading those choices carefully enough told you things, where the builder had learned their trade, what school of thought they belonged to, what they considered important. He read them, he cross-referenced them against published cryptographic literature, against technical standards documents from 5 different galactic standard communications consortia, against archive security research he pulled from 3 separate gray market technical libraries. The architecture was sophisticated, genuinely sophisticated, not just expensive, and it bore the fingerprint of someone with formal training in a specific tradition of distributed security design that had been developed primarily in a set of 3 engineering institutions in the mid-ring systems. He noted that he traced the manufacturing signatures on the tracker node's core components, the ones he'd cataloged on the first night, the ones that had told him the hardware was sophisticated without telling him where it came from. Components left traces too. Metallurgical compositions, fabrication tolerances, the specific impurities in the crystalline structures of circuit elements that reflected the particular refining processes of particular manufacturing facilities. He had tools for reading these signatures because they were relevant to his work. Counterfeit components were endemic in the outering parts market, and knowing the genuine article from the fake required exactly this kind of material analysis. The core processor in the tracker node had come from a fabrication facility in the Auris industrial cluster. He knew this because he'd seen that specific impurity profile before, in a navigation chip from a ship he'd serviced 8 months ago whose owner had bought spares from a reputable supplier in that cluster. The Auris cluster had 3 registered fabrication facilities. One of them had a sales record he could access through a public commercial database, not the full record, but the high-level aggregate data that regulated markets were required to publish. He cross-referenced order volumes against the timeline of pale chain activity he'd assembled from missing persons reports. The correlation was not proof, it was a thread, he pulled it. He worked in the particular state that overtook him on complex problems, not excited, not urgent, but deeply, completely engaged, the way a river is engaged with moving downhill. It was the state where time became strange, where he would look up from his workbench and discover that 6 hours had passed and register this as information rather than surprise. He ate when he thought of it. He slept in short, deliberate intervals, setting an alarm and lying down with the specific intentionality of a machine performing scheduled maintenance, because he understood that the quality of his thinking degraded without sleep, and degraded thinking led to errors, and errors were not acceptable here. The shape of the network revealed itself over days. Not all at once, not in the dramatic, cinematic way that revelations arrived in the entertainment media that his neighbors watched, where a single crucial piece of information unlocked everything simultaneously. It came the way understanding always came to Darien, the way it came to anyone who was genuinely paying attention. Incrementally, each new piece of information modifying the picture slightly, narrowing the range of what was possible, until the range became narrow enough that what remained was not certainty, but something close enough to certainty that the distinction stopped mattering practically. He found the relay node on Verath 9 on the fifth day. It was in a vending unit in a transit corridor 2 levels below the residential block. A standard refreshment dispenser of the kind that occupied every corridor intersection on every station in the outer rings, unremarkable to the point of invisibility, which was precisely the point. The relay hardware had been integrated into the vending unit's own communication module, piggybacking on the unit's legitimate network registration to disguise its traffic, using the vending unit's power supply to avoid the independent power signature that a standalone relay would produce. It was, Darien noted with the flat professional appreciation he gave to all well-executed engineering regardless of its purpose, elegantly done. He studied it for 3 days before he touched it. He studied how it worked, how it was connected, what it was connected to, how traffic flowed through it, and where it went. He studied the pale chain's communication pattern, not the content which he couldn't access, but the rhythm and the volume and the timing, the metadata that no encryption protected because metadata was not considered content and was therefore not protected the same way. A gap in their otherwise careful architecture that reflected the particular blind spot of people who were excellent at security and somewhat less excellent at the theory of what security was for. Metadata told him enough. It told him specifically that the relay node on Verath 9 was one of 47 nodes in a distributed network that he could map, not completely, not to the precise location of every physical component, but topologically, in terms of how the nodes related to each other, what the traffic patterns between them implied about the operational structure of the organization they served. He mapped it on paper, in the same visual mathematical shorthand he used for load calculations and stress diagrams, filling 12 pages with the topology of something that had managed to remain invisible for 6 years by being too complex to trace from any single point of entry. He was not entering from a single point. He was reading the whole structure at once, the way he read a machine not part by part in sequence but as a unified system, looking for the logic that made all the parts relate to each other, looking for the place where the logic followed to its end, revealed the thing it was meant to conceal. He found the thing on the 9th day. Not the operational headquarters. The pale chain had no operational headquarters by design, but the financial infrastructure. The specific relay pathway through which operational payments moved, which was distinct from the communication pathway in its timing and volume, and which connected through 4 intermediary nodes to a banking registry in a jurisdiction that required public filing of ownership records for registered financial entities. The ownership records were public. They were dense, technical, deliberately structured to be difficult to read, the legal equivalent of encryption, but they were public. Darien read them the way he read technical manuals. He had names by the morning of the 10th day. Not all of them, the structure had more layers than 10 days of work could fully penetrate, but enough. Enough to know the shape of the accountability, enough to know which names connected to which operations. Enough to know specifically which officials and which regulatory bodies had received payments from which financial entities in the chain, which was the part that had allowed the pale chain to survive 3 partial investigations, because the investigators had, in each case, been working with information that had been quietly edited before it reached them by people who appeared on Darien's pages as nodes in a network. He sat with his 12 pages of topology and his list of names and the tracker node in its sealed container, and thought for a long time about what to do with it. The answer he arrived at was characteristically simple and characteristically complete. He gave it to everyone at once. The device he built for that purpose was the least mechanically impressive thing he'd built all week. It was small, about the size of a thick datapad, housed in a plain composite case that he'd machined from the same material he used for equipment housings, with a single physical interface port and a power cell rated for about 40 minutes of operation. The electronics inside were dense but not exotic. The software was the most complex thing about it, a structured broadcast protocol that would, when the device was connected to the pale chain's relay node for a minimum of 30 seconds, access the relay's connection to the network, authenticate using the encryption keys he derived from his analysis of the tracker node's architecture, and distribute a compiled data package to a set of pre-programmed recipients simultaneously. The recipients were the Galactic Coalition's Anti-Trafficking Division, 12 investigative journalism outlets with demonstrated track records of reporting on organized crime in the Outer Rings, the Draconi Sovereignty Council's Legal Affairs Department, which he'd identified as operating independently of the regulatory channels the Pale Chain had compromised. The Coalition's Financial Crimes Unit, separate from the General Enforcement Division that the compromised officials were connected to. And the Aurelian Department of Commerce. He added the Aurelian Department of Commerce because they had no jurisdiction over anything the Pale Chain did, because they had no connection to the case, and because they were, in his assessment, the most aggressively thorough bureaucratic institution in their quadrant of the galaxy, and the Pale Chain's financial records were going to require exactly that kind of attention. He had also, and this was the closest thing to humor he allowed himself in the entire enterprise, included a cover note for the Aurelian filing that described the data as potentially relevant commercial intelligence, in the specific regulatory language that triggered their mandatory investigation protocol. The data package itself was the 12 pages of topology, the full financial record analysis, the manufacturing signatures and their sourced provenance, the encryption architecture fingerprint and its institutional connection, the metadata analysis and what it implied about operational structure, the tracker node with full technical documentation, the anticoagulant compound analysis with its implications for the pharmaceutical black market. The names of the compromised officials with the specific payment records connecting them to Pale Chain financial entities, and the 47-node network map with annotations. It was the most precisely documented anonymous tip the galaxy's law enforcement infrastructure had ever received. He had done, as the lead investigator would later say, half their job for them. He had made the other half impossible to avoid. He delivered it on a Tuesday. Not because Tuesday had particular significance, but because it was the day the vending unit in question underwent its weekly automated diagnostic cycle, which caused a 12-minute window during which the unit's internal systems were occupied with self-testing and its external logging was suspended. This was documented in the vending unit's public maintenance schedule, which was public because maintenance schedules were boring and nobody looked at them. Darian looked at them. He arrived at the corridor intersection at the beginning of the diagnostic window, carrying a service toolkit that was appropriate for a maintenance visit to a vending unit, and that happened to also contain, in its lower left compartment, the broadcast device in its plain composite case. He opened the vending unit service panel, his station contractor certification gave him the access code, and spent the first 4 minutes performing a visual inspection of the unit's refrigeration coupling, which was genuinely slightly worn and which he noted in the maintenance log with professional conscientiousness, because it was worn and it should be noted. Then he connected the device to the relay node's interface port. He stood with his hands in the service panel and watched the device's single status indicator, a small light no larger than a pinhead that ran through a sequence he designed to correspond to the broadcast stages. Connecting, authenticating, compiling, distributing. The distribution took 22 seconds. He watched the light complete its sequence, disconnect cleanly, and go dark. He removed the device. He replaced the service panel. He completed his maintenance log entry, nodding the refrigeration coupling and recommending replacement within 60 days. He closed his toolkit. He walked home. The corridor was quiet around him. The station hummed. A loading droid trundled past on its programmed route, indifferent. The atmospheric recyclers moved their recycled air through their vents, which smelled faintly of copper because the filters were due for changing again. He noted that he'd change them tomorrow. The Pale Chain's operation collapsed in 72 hours. Not gradually, not in the slow, procedural way that legal processes typically moved, the way that criminal organizations typically unraveled, through months of investigation and careful prosecution building. The simultaneous delivery of the data packaged to recipients who had no connection to each other, who therefore could not be individually managed or delayed or quietly discouraged by the compromised officials who had protected the Pale Chain through 3 previous investigations, produced something that the Pale Chain had never encountered and had not designed their careful architecture to withstand. Simultaneous, uncoordinated, unstoppable momentum. The investigative journalism outlets published within 6 hours, not the full story, not yet, but enough. Enough to make the compromised officials immediately, publicly radioactive in a way that made their continued interference in the investigation an act of transparent self-incrimination. The Galactic Coalition's Financial Crimes Unit, receiving a package that made their entire investigative workload look like an afternoon's administrative filing, began executing asset freezes within 8 hours. The Draconi Sovereignty Council, receiving documentation of 6 years of predation against their people in more precise detail than any previous intelligence had provided, issued a response that combined formal legal action with the particular quality of draconian institutional resolve that made several planetary governments quietly and urgently review every agreement they had with every entity connected to the network. The 41 arrests came in waves over the first 3 days, as enforcement agencies across 9 systems compared their independently received packages and found that they held, collectively, a complete picture, that what any single agency couldn't prove from its own piece of the data was provable in combination with the pieces held by the others, and that Darien had structured the package to make those combinations explicit. Nodding in the documentation which evidentiary elements, from which sections combine to establish which specific legal elements of which specific charges. He had, in the words of one prosecutor who later gave a recorded statement to an investigative documentary, essentially written the prosecution brief for them. We needed to verify, confirm, and formalize, she said, but the architecture of the case, the logic of it, the way the evidence connected was already there. Whoever assembled that package understood not just what the evidence was but what it meant and how it fit together. It was the most complete criminal intelligence document I've encountered in 20 years of prosecution work, and it arrived from a vending machine. She paused for a moment after saying that last sentence, as if still processing it. From a vending machine, she repeated, in a transit corridor on a mid-range outer ring station. The Coalition investigators traced the data dump to Verath 9 within 4 days, to the vending unit within 6, to the maintenance log entry and the contractor certification attached to it within 7. They came to Base 7 on the morning of the 8th day, 2 investigators, one of them the 20-year veteran who would later give the interview, both of them carrying the specific expression of people who have been following a trail of extraordinary competence and are arriving at what they expect to be a complicated destination. Darien opened the door before they knocked. He had heard their footsteps in the corridor and recognized the pattern: 2 people, unhurried but deliberate, pausing at specific intervals to check unit numbers, the walk of people who knew where they were going but had never been there before. He looked at them, they looked at him. The investigator, her name was Coordinator Selene Keth, with the silver-gray complexion of her species and the kind of eyes that had seen a great deal, and had not been made cynical by it, but had been made very precise, studied him for a moment with those precise eyes. You did maintenance on a vending unit in the G-level transit corridor on the 14th, she said. It was not a question. Yes, he said, refrigeration coupling, noted in the log. I can provide the replacement part invoice if you need it for the record. A pause. The relay node that was integrated into that unit's communication module broadcast a data package to 14 separate recipients simultaneously during your maintenance window, she said. I noticed a signal irregularity in the unit's communication module, Darien said. I documented my findings and forwarded them to the relevant authorities. I wasn't sure of the proper channels, so I used several. Another pause, longer. Selene looked at him with her precise eyes. He looked back at her with his quiet, considering ones. You want to tell me, she said slowly, that you noticed a passive signal relay node integrated into a vending unit's communication system during a routine refrigeration coupling check. The diagnostic cycle flags irregularities across all integrated systems, Darien said. I was thorough. And the 12 pages of network topology. I like to be complete. And the financial record analysis. The records were public, I read them. And the encryption architecture fingerprint with its institutional attribution. I had reference materials. Selene was quiet for a very long moment. She had the expression of someone who was doing several things simultaneously, processing information, making assessments, deciding how to proceed, and somewhere beneath all of that, working to contain something that might have been amusement if she'd allowed it to surface fully. Mr. Voss, she said finally. Oh yes. Are you going to tell me that you assembled a complete intelligence package on a 6-year cross-system, organized crime network, while doing routine maintenance on a vending machine? Darien considered the precise wording of this. I noticed a signal irregularity, he said, and I followed up on it. The silence between them had a texture to it. Then Selene reached into her jacket and produced a datapad and said, with the composure of a professional who had decided to simply work with the situation as it was presented, I'm going to need you to walk me through your technical findings in detail, for the prosecution record. I can do that, Darien said. Do you want coffee first? Selene looked at him. Yes, she said, with the tone of someone who needed it more than they wanted to admit. I think I do. Sirek was standing in the corridor outside their units when Selene and her colleague left, 3 hours later. He was standing because he could stand now. The exoskeleton had done its work through the first weeks. The heating element maintaining the tissue temperature that accelerated healing, the biocompound clearing the last of the anticoagulant, the joint held at the correct angle through every day of recovery. The wing was folded properly against his body, the healed joint sitting at the geometry it was meant to sit at, the 11-degree deviation corrected, the tissue set right. He was copper green in the corridor light, his scales holding their warmth back. He watched the investigators leave with amber eyes that gave nothing away, then turned those eyes to Darian, who had come to his door to see the investigators out and was now standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets. They regarded each other. The station's news network was already running the story. Darian could hear it faintly from someone's unit above, the announcer's voice carrying the particular compressed urgency of galactic-scale news breaking, names and figures, and the word unprecedented used 3 times in 4 sentences. Sirek listened to it without looking away from Darian. 41 arrests, he said. So far, Darian said. 9 systems. 11 by end of week. The Aurelian filing will take longer, but it'll be more thorough. Sirek was quiet. His tail moved slowly, and in that slow movement was the entire complicated whether front of something vast being processed, grief and relief, and something that was not quite either of those things but lived in the space between them. The feeling of a wound being real and the cause of it being addressed, and those 2 facts existing simultaneously. There were others, Sirek said, his voice was very quiet, before me for years. Yes, Darian said, he did not soften it or surround it with words that might have taken the edge off. It was true and Sirek knew it was true and the truth deserved to be met directly. Sirek closed his eyes, held them closed for a moment that lasted long enough to mean something, then opened them. You could not have known, he said, when you found me. No, Darian said, but I could learn after. Another silence. The news voice continued above them. Somewhere, unprecedented cooperation across enforcement agencies, complete financial network exposed, the Draconi Sovereignty Council has issued. Sirek looked at him with those deep amber eyes. And then he did the thing that had no word in any human language, the slow, deliberate lowering of his head, the full weight of it, the formal Draconi gesture of deep personal honor, the one that for a 12-foot dragon was not a small thing and was never performed lightly and meant, in its fullest sense, something closer to I see you completely, and what I see deserves to be formally recognized than any translation could fully carry. He held it for a moment, then raised his head. Darian had his hands in his pockets. He held the amber gaze with his quiet dark eyes and felt the weight of the gesture land in him the way real things landed, not lightly, not with performance, but with the full specific gravity of something true. You didn't have to do all of that, Sirek said. The healing was enough. The healing fixed the symptom, Darian said. That's not the same thing. The dragon looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through the amber of his eyes, not readable exactly, but present, the way a deep current is present beneath a surface. No, Sirek said, it is not. They stood together in the corridor, in the quiet space between their units, while somewhere across 11 systems the last pieces of something that had run for 6 years finished falling irreversibly apart, while investigators compared files and prosecutors built cases and journalists assembled narratives, and the Aurelian Department of Commerce began what would turn out to be a 14-month financial audit of extraordinary thoroughness. While all of that happened, the 2 of them stood in a corridor on a mid-range outer ring station, and were simply what they were, neighbors in the truest, oldest sense, the people you came home to, the people whose footsteps through a wall meant something, the people for whom you left food outside a door and fixed a vending machine and held a dragon's neck in a dim corridor for 47 minutes until the worst of it passed. Darian picked up his toolbox from just inside his door. The atmospheric recycler vent above them smelled faintly of copper. He had filters to change. Coffee, he said. Yes, said Sirek. The mechanic and the dragon went inside, and the station hummed around them, and somewhere above the recycler smelled the news kept running, and neither of them listened to it, because the work was done and what mattered was already here, already quiet, already home.